All right, let's get started. So why are you here? Why are you here? Why take 2 days out of your schedule that's, I'm sure, very, very full, and come and think and reflect around discipleship? You could go to a conference about youth ministry or children's ministry or assimilation or outreach or any number of things, but you're here for discipleship. Why is it so important? One of the most watched TED Talks, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called Start With Why by Simon Sinek. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it. And basically, Simon argues that if you want to get the power of something, you need to get down to the lowest and biggest why of what you're doing. Not what you're doing it and how you're doing it, but why you're doing it. So why should we even care about discipleship? About growing disciples? Now you're going to say, hey, the Great Commission, Jesus commanded us to, right? Go and make disciples. Now actually that go is an aorist passive, so those of you who had Greek in seminary know that aorist passive is like as you were going, are going, and will be going. The real command there is make disciples. Jesus commanded us to do it. It should be enough. But we're a bit like the stiff-necked Israelites. We don't obey commands very well. So why would Jesus have commanded us to make disciples? Some even say that post-resurrection, it's the only command Jesus gave the church. I'm not sure if that's quite correct, but that's what some argue. Why would he give it? Well, what's a deeper reason? One deeper reason may be that this world needs better people. Jesus said, you are going to have trouble. And he didn't say it, but somebody else said with a capital T, right here in Bayou City, in the good old American USA, right? Trouble, chaos, frustration. How would this world be different if it was filled with deeper people who were more deeply in love with the living God? It wouldn't be bland and boring. I hope you don't think it'd be bland and boring. It'd be rich. Think of a world of people of a variety of personalities and cultures and nationalities, and yet they find it easier to be filled with hope, with patience, with the ability to forgive others. Think of that. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And yet, contrast that to today, the factions and fracturing. On Facebook, I have a lot of friends who are of a lot of different persuasions politically and socially. And sometimes it just grieves me to see what people, it's like you're standing up and saying to everybody some of the things we say, it's just, it's just very grieving. What kind of world would it be like if more of us were deeply in love with Jesus, and that we could be more curious about others and without feeling threatened by them, and we could be seen as people of deep love? Now think of people you may know who reach out to others in deep and meaningful ways. There was a study, we'll talk a little bit about it, called Reveal for Church. And they've studied over 500,000 people thus far. And what they found over that whole survey is that those people who are to the right of the spectrum, who are well developed as disciples, they're not your complainers in your church. They actually, if they got a complaint, they probably won't say it because they don't want to undermine the ministry. These are people who are deeply and quietly loving. These are people who find it more easy to forgive. These are people who are more patient. They show it in this test. They are the most developed disciples. As studying leaders, we say that we are about helping people flourish. And by flourishing, we mean going deeper with God. That's what a disciple does. And discipleship is the practice of going deeper. It's not like a on and off switch. You love me, you love me not. It's more like a brightener switch or a dimmer switch, right? Like a marriage, with intention, you grow deeper. With inattention, you atrophy. And yet there is so much inattention to discipleship in our churches. So what does it look like when somebody is flourishing? In Genesis 1 and 2, we're told about Adam and Eve living in intimacy with God. Then Revelation 21, you see the passage here. We're told about at the end where there's no tear, that God is dwelling with his people. And in between you see Psalm 16. You fill me with joy in your presence. Or Jesus' prayer in John 17 for his disciples. May they be one, Father, as you and I in the Spirit are one. You know, in my mind, I get the picture of really deep people that you can trust, that are getting along better with others, and the world needs these disciples. So maybe that's a deeper why. Maybe that's why Jesus said it. Or maybe there's a deeper why yet. You say the world needs it. What about the church? We at least start there. I mean, you see on Facebook, church members and leaders in our church and some of the things they say to each other, you think, is that what Christ would have us do and be? So many of our churches are struggling with external pressures and internal pressures, pressures of attendance and finances, and people wrestling to get the upper hand and power controls. A friend of mine, Sylvie, who's pastor of a church here in Houston, a rather large church that's planted several churches, he said, you know, in the 90s and the early aughts, it was easy. I mean, people just came in droves, and all of a sudden in the mid-aughts, it just got so much harder, and it's so hard today. And you could probably say the same thing in ministry, right? Maybe Jesus loved his church, and so he's saying, make disciples because we need better churches. I recently read a sad statistic, and it was provided me by my friend, Dr. Adams, and it's about churches in South Carolina. Why South Carolina? Well, they did a study of all the Protestant churches, Lutheran, Presbyterian, United Methodist, Southern Baptist, probably didn't pick up all the independent, but they had almost 100 churches that since 2011 had closed. And Texas is probably just as many, if not more. My own denomination, I've recently heard of churches that in the 70s were like the church. Nothing would happen to it. They're closing their doors. Dr. Adams? Dr. Adams is he was the dean of the School of Business at the University of Houston. And he is one who's intensely interested in societal trends. And I asked him to just say a word or two about why he thinks the church needs disciples. In his own church life, he's volunteered as a leader of the tech ministries, right? He's done that for years. So Mike right there, if you take that.
Mike asked me to come up and just say like 2 sentences. Hey, John. That he must not remember his professors very well because you never say 2 sentences as a professor. I've already exceeded that.
I trust you.
And it's been my really deep pleasure to have been pastored by, loved by, and serve in some really fantastic churches. And churches have pushed me, they've grown me, and they've hurt me. Well, it shouldn't be that way, but churches are full of people, and people are that way. Now, it's as somebody who studies leadership and studies strategy, I was able to work with a lot of churches and talk about, okay, where do you want to be when you grow up, sort of thing. I love the statistic that says, or I guess Mike mentioned, that it takes 8 or 10 years to change a church culture. You know how long the average pastor stays at a church? 8 years. So sometimes, my phone's going off, sorry. Sometimes that change can be hard, disruptive, painful. In fact, most of the things we go through as humans when we grow, whether it's growing a muscle, a new way of thinking, all of that can be hard. So the work that happens with ascending leaders can be hard, but just like that muscle, it's going to be really worth it. Now, as a church strategy person, I like to ask a pastor, which of these 3 doors keeps you awake at night? Is it the front door, getting more people in? Is it that leaky back door where people come out, they sneak away, they fade off into their lives? Or is it that open door? Now, open door is kind of, some people say, oh yeah, our front door is wide, but no, that's a different thing. Now, we can see church programs that are designed for that front door. Let's bring it in. Let's have a great child care area. Let's have parking lot attendants, all of that to get people in. And those are great. That's a strategy that you really, really want to think through and have. Then you've got that other strategy that says, let's figure out why people are leaving. Let's chase them down. Let's have coffee. Why aren't you here anymore? Let's see what we can do. But that open door one says, what I think the way I like to think about open door is my childhood church in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And there in the lobby, we didn't call it a lobby, we called it a narthex. And, I had no idea what that meant, but it was a lobby to me. But there in the narthex was a big painting about the size of this screen of Jesus standing at the door and knocking and say, open the door. And that's actually what being a disciple really is. And that's the kind of door that I think a lot of pastors really spend a lot of time worrying about, and a lot of lay leaders worry about. Am I growing closer and closer to what Jesus modeled? Who's the worst team in baseball this year? Orioles. You know what their winning percentage was? 0.29. They didn't even win a third of their games. It's a wonder anybody showed up to their games. You know what their average attendance was? 20,000. That's bigger than my hometown. So even a team that sucked still has people attending. Now, those are fans that are going to be there no matter what. So the Baltimore goes to the World Series, those 20,000 people are going to still be there. That's what church people call, that's my core. Now, you want to take those folks that are going to be with you through the good times and the bad times, through the times when the muscle is tired, when your brain is tired, and say, we want you to be a fan of Jesus. And we want you to get deeper, model what he showed us. And Ascending Leaders does that. It's just going to take a while. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Just to let you know a little bit about me, my adjective for the disciples was stinky. My friend Stan Napper said that tells you a lot about me.
So the local church, we need to be doing this. That may be the deeper reason, number two. And yet at the same time, there's a problem of passive discipleship. I mean, don't we give attention to kids and through middle school and then high school, and then we basically say you're on your own. And it's like a smorgasbord. You can go pick up one thing or another. Or when I was in college, we go down the line and we say, I want this, I don't want that. And we should just kind of go on through passively. Passive discipleship. And we lack intention. How many times have you ever thought of it, said, how is your Sunday school class going? Or how did that outreach thing going? And the answer is, well, great, we had 70 people show up. Great, we had 300 people show up. And they all loved it. How many times have they said, people grew closer to Jesus because of it? The church needs this. So that may be the deeper reason. Or maybe another possible deeper reason, the church needs better leaders. You may say, well, I hear what you're saying about discipleship, but we have a shortage of leaders, and our leaders aren't all that great. We need better leaders. Well, usually when we start a conference, we're not doing it today, but often what we'll do is we'll ask people to download all of the leadership issues they're facing in their church. And we'll get a list of 70, 80, 90 between all the churches. And then I ask, how many of those are about loving God more deeply and better loving others? We start checking them off. 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%. And then so of course someone who's smart will say, all of them. If you pay attention to discipleship, you will have done the major part of your leadership development already. Yeah, there's some leadership skills it's good to train in, but if you do discipleship well, that will take care of more severe issues. And if you try to build leadership without doing discipleship well, then whatever you're doing with your leaders is going to implode. You've seen it, right? Somebody who's a strong leader in your church, you think you can count on, and just everything implodes. And you learn later that you didn't realize how unconnected they were with Christ. So discipleship is critical. And those are maybe 3 reasons that Jesus said this. But there's a few more reasons, I think. And Bob is going to share with you just a couple more reasons, what might be deeper reasons for why we should care about discipleship.
Thank you, Mike. Since we were talking about the Orioles a minute ago, I feel obligated to point out that among us, the Reverend Dr. Pat Sparks, there in the back row, his son Lamar plays for the Orioles, but he was on the injured list this year, so that's why their record was so bad. But next year...
We're just making room for him to come on out.
Anyway, my name is Bob Johnson. I'm executive pastor at Chapelwood Methodist. Here, there's actually 2 Chapelwoods in this area. I know it's very confusing. So Peter Camerano is the pastor at what I call the Chapelwood, and then we're at the other Chapelwood. I just want to tell you really quickly how I got associated with Ascending Leaders. I had been doing discipleship pathway development work at our church for a long time, and really butting my head against the wall for a bunch of reasons that I might get time to go into later. One day I was babysitting my, at that time, 2-year-old granddaughter, who was, this had to be a Holy Spirit moment. She was asleep for a nap. And I had my computer and I was surfing the internet for stuff on discipleship. Because when you get stuck, that's what you do, right? You go to Google. And I came across these videos of this guy named Mike Johnson from this group called Ascending Leaders doing a DiscipleForward workshop at a church up in the Midwest. And they're on these videos are on YouTube, and I watched all 6 of them, and man, I was just, that's exactly what we need. That's exactly what I'm thinking. That's exactly where we need to go. So by the time my granddaughter woke up, I had watched all the videos, and I thought, I got to get in touch with that guy. So we made connection, and Mike's actually was coaching us at Chapelwood, and I became so passionate about the work that Ascending Leaders does and the impact that they made on us that I asked how I could help out. So I want to give you 2 more reasons for why we are focused on making disciples. The first one is really an expansion of what Mike was saying earlier, but it's very localized to our Chapelwood context. If you take what Mike said and you put it on the ground at a real life church, that's one of the reasons I want to show you. And then the second one is maybe a little bit deeper yet because it's a little bit more of a theological reason. All right, reason number 4 for why we ought to focus on making disciples is what I learned at Chapelwood by taking our church taking the Reveal Spiritual Life Assessment. Anybody ever heard of this instrument? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Okay, it's about half the group. So Reveal originally came out of Willow Creek Church in Chicago, but it's been kind of its own independent thing since 2008. And what it does is it's a survey that you give to the people in your congregation, and it tells you a whole lot about the state of discipleship in your church. We're going to introduce you to a 4-stage discipleship model in a little while. And the Reveal survey actually tells you how many people are at each stage of that discipleship model. It tells you a lot about their beliefs and attitudes and practices. It's an incredible amount of insight that you gain from the Reveal survey. And I want to show you some of the things that we learned by doing that survey. Now, in your packet, there's actually a sheet of paper. I think it's called Why Should We Care? And it lists a whole lot more. I want to just pick out 3 of the questions that came out of the survey and show you how the people that sit in my pews on Sunday morning answered those questions and how that compares to the stage of which stage of the 4-stage discipleship model they're in. I think it's really, really enlightening. So the first question is, it's not really a question, it's a statement, then you're asked whether you agree with it or not. the degree to which you agree with it. So the statement is, God's grace enables me to forgive people who hurt me. So think about what Mike was saying a little bit ago about factions and divisions in the world in which we live. And so here's a statement that because I have experienced God's grace, I'm able to forgive people who hurt me. Now, at Chapelwood, 16% of the people who are in stage 1, which we call exploring Christ, the very earliest stage of discipleship, 16% of the people say, yeah, I agree with that. God's grace helps me to forgive. But look, it goes all the way up to 67% of people who are in the more mature stage 4 stage of that discipleship model. People who have experienced God's grace find that in their lives, they are able to forgive others more easily. Mike was talking about we need a better world. I mean, being able to forgive others, that's kind of at the heart of it. Here's another one. I believe a Christian should lead a sacrificial life not driven by a pursuit of material things. A whopping 0% of our stage 1 Chapelwood people agreed with that statement. Now, it went up to a whopping 48% of our more mature stage 4 people. You might wish that it would be higher than that, but you can clearly see the progression from 0 to 48. And I haven't showed you the 2 stages in between, but you can see there's a progression of people agreeing with this statement. You know, we live in a world increasingly fractured, as Mike pointed out, violence. Every day on the news you read about violence that's broken out from perceived insults, inability to forgive. We live in a world where poverty is rampant, and governments either can't or won't help people sometimes. And so we need the church to be, we need people to become disciples so that they can develop these forgiving, generous hearts. Look at this one. I study the Bible to know God, the truth, and to find direction. So a big 4% of our congregation who are in stage 1 agreed with that statement. But it climbs all the way to 65% for people who are in that more mature stage 4. So what all this, I hope, is showing you is why should we care about discipleship? Because it's making a real difference in real people who I can show you on Sunday morning at our church. On your sheet there, why should we care? There's a lot more questions, and even that's just a sampling of the data that we got. But my bottom line is that this work that we're doing of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world makes a real difference in the people's lives that we know. All right, let's shift into an even bigger why. An even bigger why that we should care about making disciples in our churches. Now, most of the time when I ask people, why should we care about making disciples? People will usually say, because Jesus told us to. And they'll point to the Great Commission. Matthew 28, 18 to 20. There it is on the screen. You probably have it memorized, but let's read it. All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Now, unfortunately, I think if we put the focus on, see if I press this button, there we go. If we put the focus there on go and make disciples, it simply becomes then a command that we're supposed to follow. And maybe lacks kind of the heart motivation that I think is really built into the passage. What if we put the focus on this line instead? All authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples. I think this is the message that all 4 of the gospel writers are really trying to get us to understand, that all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Let me ask you this question. Lots of titles are used to refer to Jesus in the Gospels. Son of God, Holy One, and so forth. But what's the title that Jesus applies to himself more than any other title? Anybody know? Alex, do you know? Right, Son of Man. Good job, Alex. Yes, Son of Man. Now, anybody, Kevin, you remember when we went to seminary and they told us about Son of Man? You remember the passage in the Old Testament where that comes from? Right, Daniel 7. Yeah. Jesus, when he refers to himself as the Son of Man, is very intentionally referring to a passage that would have been very much on the minds of his contemporaries, and it's a passage that comes out of Daniel 7. And there it is on the screen. Let's read that one together. This is the prophet Daniel's having a vision, and this is what he sees. As I watched, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Now, before you keep reading, okay, a little drum roll. Okay, so the Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days sitting on the throne in heaven, and what happened? He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. One of the things that I'm convinced that the gospel writers were trying to convince us of is that Jesus is that Son of Man, and that his resurrection was the validation that Jesus was the one who has been given authority and glory and sovereign power, and because of this authority and glory, all peoples, all nations, men and women of every language shall come and worship him. So why did Jesus say, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations"? Because God has given Jesus authority to reestablish God's glory among his people and to establish God's saving rule on earth, so that God's original will, purpose, and intent for humankind can be fulfilled. Now that raises another question. Well, what is God's original will, purpose, and intent for humankind? Kevin, do you remember what the first chapter? See, this is the disadvantage of being my roommate in seminary. Kevin, do you remember what the first chapter in the Bible is called? What book? Genesis. And what's the first chapter? Chapter 1. See? People go to Southern Methodist University, they come out and they're sharp on the Bible. Probably going to regret you actually came by the time if I keep calling on you, but I'll try to pick on someone else. I can pick on Alex, I pick on Pat. I pick on Sherry. Yeah, that's true. All right, so let's go all the way back then to the first chapter in the Bible. And I want to introduce you to something I call the Genesis Project. My idea is that God is working the Genesis Project all the way through the Bible. It starts in Genesis, it's laid out in Genesis, but it works its way all the way through the Bible, including into the New Testament. But here's the first chapter of Genesis, and I think this is the key passage for us to understand. And believe me, I'm going to come back to what does all this have to do with making disciples. Let's read this one together. God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, overlook the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. What does it mean to be created in God's image? Do you notice how many times that idea is repeated in that verse? I've underlined 3 of them, but you can even say, well, likeness is talking about in God's image too, so 3.5, right? They taught us, Alex, at SMU, that when the Bible repeats something, it's probably important. So something there we ought to pay attention to. So what does it mean to be created in God's image? Well, books and books have been written about that, but just one thing I want to hone your attention to. As Christians, we believe that God's nature fundamentally is triune. God exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. There's a oneness that is profoundly wrapped up in the three-ness of God. There's this wonderful quote I came across. Sister Nona Harrison's actually an Eastern Orthodox nun, but I love this quote. She says, it's a picture of the oneness in the Trinity. She said, the three divine persons are forever united with each other in mutual love. They dwell in each other, not with, but in each other. They collaborate continually, sharing as one in all their activities. Though they are three persons, they are one God, and they always act in unanimity. So that's the nature of the God whose image we are to represent. I think when you read that first chapter of Genesis, you kind of get the impression that God has created a temple. But it's not a building, it's heaven and earth. And just like all the gods of that day, that God has placed an image in his temple. But it isn't a statue, it's us, it's flesh and blood. And our job is to reflect the image of God. Well, what is that image of God that we're called to reflect? There is this profound oneness in God that we're created to reflect. And I think that oneness that we are called to reflect can be described as a oneness in four dimensions. A oneness in our relationship with God, our oneness in our relationship with one another, a oneness in our relationship with the creation, stewardship. I was teaching this one time and somebody said, oh, you mean like a park ranger? Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the park ranger doesn't own the park, but they are called to take care of the park as if it was their own. And finally, a oneness in our relationship even with ourselves. A wholeness, a sense of intimacy. So as we reflect the image of God in God's temple, which is heaven and earth, we are created, authentic humanity was created to reflect into the world this oneness in these four dimensions. In our relationship with God, in our relationship with each other, in our relationship with the creation, the rest of creation, and in our relationship with ourselves. Now, here's what I think the writers of the New Testament are trying to say. They're trying to say, hey, folks, you know that Genesis project that we've been studying about for 2,000 years? Jesus is the fulfillment of it. Jesus has come, God has come in the flesh in Jesus to manifest what authentic Christian, authentic humanity looks like. Here's someone who lives out this oneness in these four dimensions. So then, when in the book of Acts, chapter 1, you know the story of the ascension when Jesus, he's basically saying, I would not have done this if I was God. Sam, I wouldn't have left you in charge. I'm sorry, but I wouldn't have left you in charge. I wouldn't leave me in charge. But that's exactly what he did. As he ascended back to heaven, he says, the Holy Spirit's about to come, right? He says, okay, you got it now. I'm passing it off to you. Now it's your job to reflect God's image in these four key relationships in the world. I'm not going to leave you alone to do that, but it's going to be now your job. So Jesus brings the fulfillment of the Genesis project. And in commanding us to make disciples, he's handing off that commitment to us. Disciples, all of this has been to get to this point. Disciples are the means by which God is implementing that project that he began all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, and which carries all the way through the Bible. Disciples are the means by which God wants to bring oneness in those four key dimensions into the world. So when Jesus says go and make disciples, it's not just like your mother saying clean up your room. You better do it because your mother said to, right? It's more than that. It's way, way more than that. By making disciples, we get to bring into being that which has been deep within God's heart since the very beginning. When we talk about making disciples, we're talking about something that is at the deepest place in God's heart. And that's why all of these reasons that Mike talked about the problems that exist in the world, and the inability to forgive, and the fracturing, and the selfishness, and this and that. I mean, this is rooted in the stuff that's in Genesis. And making disciples it has been and is God's antidote to fulfill what has always been his original will and purpose. Okay, I'm going to stop talking, and I want to do a little exercise here. So you're all on tables. Some tables have 6, some have 2. Why don't you get in groups? You can do this at your table, but if 2s and 3s, okay? If you're at a table of 6, maybe you have 2 groups of 3. And just talk with each other for a few minutes about these 2 questions. You know, if you've ever seen that TED Talk where Simon Sinek talks about the power of why, basically what he's trying to say is when you know why to do something, it is extremely motivating. It is extremely empowering. My mother I always used to ask that question. Mom would say something and I'd say why, and she would say because I said so. And while that would make me do it, it wasn't very motivating. But if I knew why, I didn't even have to be told. I would do it on my own. So talk for a few minutes about the power of knowing why, and especially what might be the advantages of knowing a why that is rooted so deeply in the heart of God. So why don't we take a few minutes and talk about that, and then we'll come back and we'll hear what you said.